The Personality Brokers, The Strange History of Myers-Briggs and the Birth of the Personality Test. The book, The Personality Brokers, published in 2018, explores the origins and enduring appeal of the famous Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI personality test. Relying on meticulous historical research and recent psychological insights, the book delves into the roots of the Myers-Briggs personality test, explaining in detail what this test can truly reveal about human personality. Micro 1. Discover and explore more about your personality type. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is the most popular personality test in the world. You might have already taken it, just like the 2 million people worldwide who take it every year. Despite its widespread use by Fortune 500 companies, university admissions departments, and self-help programs globally, little is known about the origins of this test. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, commonly referred to as MBTI, is a psychometric questionnaire that measures an individual's psychological preferences in how they perceive the world and make decisions. Although the creators of the test claim to derive their central idea from Carl Jung's theories of personality types, many experts in the field, including Jung's students like Joseph Henderson, believe that Catherine Briggs and her daughter Isabel Briggs Myers misunderstood Jung's theories. The first developers of this personality assessment method were Catherine Cook Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers, who extensively studied Jung's work and designed the test. They initially created the test during World War II to help identify the most suitable jobs for women working in the military industry. The initial questions evolved, and by 1962, the test was published as the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Simultaneously, with the translation of Jung's book Psychological Types in 1923 in the United States, Myers and Briggs found Jung's ideas to be highly aligned with their own observations and theories. This motivated them to expand their research and test their ideas on a larger population. Their primary goal was to help individuals better understand themselves and explore the various, often unseen aspects of their personalities. To develop their questionnaire, Myers and Briggs sought the expertise of seasoned psychometricians and psychologists. Finally, in 1943, they published the first version of the MBTI questionnaire. Today, the MBTI test is highly popular, with nearly 2 million people in the U.S. using it annually for self-discovery. By taking this test, you can determine whether you are an introvert or an extrovert, whether you gather information intuitively or through sensing, whether you have a feeling or thinking personality, and whether you approach the external world with a perceiving or judging style. This personality test categorizes psychological differences based on 4 dichotomies, resulting in 16 distinct personality types, usually identified by their initials. According to the Myers-Briggs Institute, the difference between introversion and extroversion lies in how individuals manage and direct their energy. In this book's summary, we will embark on a journey to uncover the roots of this personality inventory. We will learn about its creators, what inspired them to dedicate their lives to the study of human personality, and how social conditions in the early 20th century contributed to the test's popularity. We will also examine how scientifically valid this popular psychological test is. Through this summary, we will learn whether the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator can truly reveal our authentic selves and what it offers that science cannot measure. Does this test have a dark side? Let's explore. Micro 2. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI, uses a simple, accessible, and non-judgmental approach to understanding personality. The Myers-Briggs personality test is the most well-known personality assessment in the world. You may have already taken it as part of a job application process or simply as a way to better understand yourself. However, for those unfamiliar with the test, let's start by examining what this popular assessment entails. Our story begins during World War II, when a mother-daughter duo named Catherine Cook Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers developed a questionnaire that later became known as the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. This test measures an individual's personality based on several dichotomies of natural human behavior, which include contrasting traits that make them easy for most of us to understand. These dichotomies are introversion, I versus extroversion, E; intuition, N versus sensing, S; feeling, F versus thinking, T; judging, J versus perceiving. The purpose of the test is to assess where an individual's personality falls along these four dichotomies. The Myers-Briggs questionnaire consists of 93 separate questions about the respondent's preferences, each of which is associated with one of the test's categories. For example, by asking whether you prefer to focus on the outer world or your inner world, the test evaluates your level of introversion or extroversion. Similarly, by asking whether you prioritize logic and consistency or people and specific circumstances when making decisions, it assesses your thinking or feeling tendencies. According to the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, your answers to such questions define and determine your personality, which can be any one of the 16 four-letter combinations derived from the test. For instance, you might be an NJ, indicating an extroverted, intuitive, thinking, and judging personality, or you could be defined as an ISFP-A, representing an introverted, sensing, feeling, and perceiving personality type. The key point is that the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is not a test with right or wrong answers. Instead, each personality type has its own strengths and weaknesses, and no type is inherently better or worse than another. For example, individuals with a feeling personality type are thought to be more empathetic, while thinking types are considered more logical problem solvers. The creators designed the test this way to ensure that test takers would not feel inferior to others after receiving their results. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is famous for its clear and non-judgmental framework. However, if people were aware of the unscientific roots from which this test originated, they might be less enthusiastic about it. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI, is based on the unscientific and unsubstantiated theories of Carl Jung. Modern publishers of the Myers-Briggs personality test do not hide the fact that Catherine Briggs and Isabel Myers built their work on the writings of one of the most famous psychologists of the 20th century, Carl Jung. Proponents of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator want us to believe that this theoretical foundation sets it apart. However, if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that Jung's theories were more speculative than factual. Catherine Briggs spent much of her adult life fascinated by the idea that human personality is innate, unchangeable, and impossible to categorize. She also believed that everyone is born with a distinct personality type. However, her questionnaire took shape after she read Jung's works. Jung's book Psychological Types, published in 1921, which argues that the human psyche is composed of opposing and complementary natural spirits, had a profound impact on Catherine. Unfortunately, Jung's ideas, which Briggs used as the foundation for her first version of the MBTI, were themselves based on highly questionable scientific principles. Jung's contemporaries and fellow psychologists were highly critical of his theories on personality. John B. Watson, a respected behavioral psychologist, noted that Jung's theories had more in common with religious mysticism than with serious empirical science. Why was Watson's critique so damning? Because there was no evidence to support Jung's theory of personality types. Jung did not see the lack of evidence as a problem and refused to subject his ideas to modern empirical testing. Why? Well, Jung believed that adopting a scientific approach to psychology could not provide a complete explanation of human personality. Instead, he sought to understand personality through religious, literary, and philosophical texts. The parts of Jung's personality type theory that Briggs and Myers drew from most heavily, those emphasizing the importance of opposing personal categories, were actually based on ideas derived from ancient Greek and African myths. In his book, Jung even references the Greek myth of the brothers Prometheus and Epimetheus, who embody the contrasting traits of foresight and perception. Ultimately, many psychologists have concluded that Jung's personality types were built on unfounded assumptions rather than scientific evidence. In fact, they provide a very shaky foundation for the Myers-Briggs questionnaire. Micro 4. Catherine Briggs became deeply fascinated with Carl Jung while developing the MBTI. There's no doubt that Catherine Briggs and Isabel Myers were inspired by Carl Jung's work, but what's less well known is that Jung was more than just an inspiration for the MBTI. In fact, Jung became an all-consuming personal obsession for Catherine Briggs. During the years she spent designing her first personality questionnaire, Briggs began to revere Jung as a divine saint. In 1923, immediately after learning about Jung's writings on personality psychology, Briggs claimed that Jung himself appeared to her in a dream. Upon waking, she lit a fire in her fireplace and burned all her previous work and notes on personality types, suddenly convinced that she no longer needed them. Determined to become Jung's most devoted follower and disciple, she spent the next 5 years transcribing passages from Psychological Types into her notebooks. She later admitted that the book had become her Bible and stated that she had begun to think of Jung's writings as a path to salvation. She stopped using Jung's name and instead referred to him reverently as the man from Zurich. Briggs later explained why she had become so obsessed with Jung, stating that he was the author and creator of all her dreams. She credited him with showing her, through his writings, all the different ways she could live and embrace life to its fullest. Briggs sought other ways to express her love for Jung that went beyond transcribing his work. She began writing stories about Jung and spent many nights awake until dawn, crafting erotic tales about him and his psychoanalysis. She wrote a novel titled The Man from Zurich, in which a psychoanalyst and his patient develop a close and sexually charged relationship. After publishers rejected the novel, she began expressing her obsession through music, rewriting the lyrics of a popular 1930s poet into a hymn titled Hail Dr. Junge. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, Catherine never met Jung, but her loyalty to him never waned throughout her life. Catherine Briggs saw Carl Jung as a prophet and a saint, and it wasn't long before millions of Americans viewed her questionnaire as a miraculous predictive power. Micro 5. Society in the early 20th century was highly receptive to Catherine Briggs's first personality questionnaires. After spending 5 years deeply immersed in Jung's writings, Briggs turned her attention outward with a plan to bring Jung's theories to the American public. The first publication of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator appeared in an article titled Meet Yourself: How to Use the Personality Paint Box, published in a magazine called The New Republic in 1926. In the article, Briggs represented each of the 16 distinct personality types with different colors in a paint box. She explained that to understand your true self, you needed to write each of Jung's personality types on test cards, arrange them in the order that best described you, and discover which color suited you most. Although she may not have realized it at the time, Briggs's unconventional approach was groundbreaking. The article, which suggested that you could improve yourself and your life through self-discovery, marked the beginning of an era of self-help and self-awareness writing. In the 1920s, American society was thirsty for such ideas. The 1920s was a time when the demand for psychological support far exceeded the number of psychologists available to provide it. Radio programs and newspapers were filled with columns and commentators seeking to address the psychological issues of the time. These included rebellious teenage girls who cut their hair into bob styles and danced to jazz music, neglectful spouses who secretly drank alcohol, and the paralyzing sense of personal inadequacy many people felt in response to the emerging consumer culture. In earlier decades, people typically turned to religious teachings for guidance. However, Briggs noticed that modern Americans were less willing to accept the kind of traditional guidance their predecessors had learned from the church. Importantly, society no longer wanted a Christian lifestyle that emphasized forgiveness in exchange for repentance. Instead, they wanted to see themselves as independent individuals, each in control of their own lives and destinies. To achieve this self-mastery, they first needed to know exactly what kind of self they were dealing with, or, in other words, what their personality truly was. Indeed, the cheerful and accessible tone of Briggs's first version of the MBTI made the journey of self-discovery seem fun and non-threatening. However, there was also a darker side to society's newfound enthusiasm for personality typing. Micro 6. For some philosophers, the very concept of personality typing was dangerous and unsettling. As World War II ravaged Europe, Isabel Myers was working on the personality type test that her mother had begun developing 20 years earlier. In Nazi Germany, Hitler's soldiers had started transporting Jews to forced labor camps. The act of categorizing people into different groups now meant something far more deadly. Isabel Myers envisioned the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator as a gentle system to help people better understand themselves. However, for many social theorists, typing personalities in this way was not entirely harmless. The most famous critic of the Myers-Briggs personality typing approach was a German social philosopher named Theodor Adorno. In his famous sociological thesis, The Authoritarian Personality, Adorno linked the kind of typological theories Isabel was working on to the racial politics of Nazi Germany. He argued that Hitler's regime had demonstrated how inhumane it was to attempt to categorize people into boxes, and that the logical endpoint of such a rigid view of humanity was a fascist society. Labeling humans without considering their individuality leads to decisions about which groups should live and which should die. Adorno argued that it didn't matter what criteria were used for categorization, whether based on racial theory or personality theory. Any attempt to label humans represented a sinister, anti-enlightenment, anti-humanitarian mindset, and an underlying tendency to manipulate and divide people by placing them into distinct classes and categories. From Adorno's perspective, personality typing also pointed to another major problem: corporate capitalism. He believed that the relatively new enthusiasm for personality typing stemmed from capitalism's need to divide society into different classes, such as owners and employees, or working-class laborers and managerial middle-class individuals. To Adorno, the idea that humans are born with innate personality types shared by millions of others was a flawed and fallacious argument. He argued that while individuals might exhibit predictable patterns of thought and behavior, this was not because such traits were innate. Rather, capitalist society had deliberately conditioned people to become profitable workers, managers, and owners. Interestingly, while Briggs and Myers saw their color-coded personality box as a tool for gaining insight into one's true self, Adorno viewed it as a dangerous tool for fascist discrimination and a means of oppression by capitalist thinking. Micro 7. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI, is scientifically invalid, yet it may still be useful. By 1980, both Catherine Briggs and Isabel Myers had passed away, but the test they created remained alive. Over 2 million people take their test every year, and the MBTI has now become an industry worth more than $2 billion, spanning over 20 languages and 25 countries. However, whether this is a cause for concern or celebration remains unclear. Unsurprisingly, for many logical and scientifically minded individuals, it is a cause for concern. After all, the theory underlying the MBTI has no basis in clinical psychology, and the test itself demonstrates this. Recent psychological studies have shown that more than half of the people who retake the test, even within a span of less than a month, are classified into a different personality type the second time. Moreover, critics argue that the 16 different personality types defined by the test are so vaguely described that any of them could apply to anyone. Yet, despite all the criticism and lack of scientific validity, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator remains the most popular personality test in the world, cherished by hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. But how can this be? The answer may lie in its ability to help people accept themselves. For many of us, self-doubt and regret are familiar aspects of the human condition. But for those who believe in the Myers-Briggs view of personality, the MBTI offers an enticing framework of self-acceptance and self-justification. Believing that our personality is innate and unchangeable can be comforting because it means we can finally accept ourselves instead of constantly striving to rebuild or change who we are. And when we know we are a specific type of person, this can serve as justification for all the decisions we've made, good or bad, and as an explanation for some of the negative things, like a difficult divorce, that may have happened in our lives. In fact, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, in its imperfect way, gives us a justification for who we are and always will be. The test may not provide us with much scientific evidence, but it can offer us reassurance. And in that sense, perhaps the MBTI has a value that cannot be measured. Final message. The key takeaway from this book summary is that the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is a popular personality test that categorizes individuals into one of 16 different personality types. Based on the writings of Carl Jung and designed by a mother-daughter duo in the first half of the 20th century, the test has little scientific validity. Nevertheless, millions of people have found their test results enlightening and transformative. While we should not consider the Myers-Briggs test scientific, it still holds unique value as a tool for reassurance and self-acceptance.